Some curses need no magic, only a heart that's been closed off for far too long. Some beasts wear no claws or fangs, but are shaped by how the world forgets them. And sometimes, the real miracle doesn't come from a wand, but from the first gaze that sees past the pain. She was just a young woman, leaving behind her humble home to pay her father's debt, unaware that she was stepping into a world full of secrets, a forgotten castle, a man the world had cast aside, a library of infinite wisdom, and a garden where the roses never died. And then, somewhere between the silence, the sorrow, and his rough exterior, something miraculous began to happen. She didn't see him change. She simply looked into his heart and changed the world around him. There was a time when everything Olivia knew felt safe, familiar, and full of beauty. Her father, Everett, had once been a respected merchant with ships crossing oceans and deals inked in elegant handwriting. The house they lived in had grand hallways and silk curtains that danced in the breeze. Life was, in every visible way, abundant. But abundance is a fragile thing. It started with rumors, then a ship disappeared, then another, a storm, a betrayal, a miscalculation. No one could agree. All Everett knew was that one by one, his investments vanished into the sea. Within weeks, the family's fortunes crumbled. Creditors knocked. Friends disappeared. Eventually, Everett sold the carriage, the silverware, the portraits, even the music box his late wife had adored. And so they left. Everett and his 6 children, 3 boys, 3 girls, moved from the city into a crooked little cottage just outside a sleepy village, the kind of place where time slowed and stars were visible at night. Of the 6 children, only one embraced the change. Olivia was the youngest, barely 18, but already the most grounded. While her older siblings sulked over lost luxuries and whined about chores, Olivia learned how to split wood and keep hens. She baked bread from scratch, mended torn sleeves, and even asked the village widow how to keep vegetables through the winter. She had a quiet courage, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. The townspeople noticed. While her siblings kept their distance, Olivia smiled, listened, and helped when she could. She became the bridge between her once proud family and the humble kindness of village life. Slowly, their modest cottage began to feel like a home. 2 years passed. And then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived. One of Everett's ships had returned. Against all odds, a single vessel had made it to port, cargo mostly intact. The children erupted in cheers, silk shoes, velvet coats, golden trinkets. They chattered over what gifts they'd request. Everett smiled, tired but hopeful. Perhaps, he thought, this was the start of rebuilding. Before departing for the port city, he asked each child what gift they'd like from town. "A hat with a jeweled band," said the eldest son. "A mirror framed in gold," added one daughter. Olivia was quiet. When her father gently prompted her, she spoke softly. "If there's a rose," she said, "just one. I've never seen one in person. Any color would be lovely." Everett chuckled. "Just a rose?" he asked. She nodded. "They don't grow here, and I've always wondered if they smell like rain." He kissed her forehead and promised to find one. The morning he left was crisp and golden. Olivia packed his saddlebag with care, adding her last piece of sugar bread for the journey. The others waved casually, distracted by their daydreams of fine things. But Olivia stood at the gate, watching until his silhouette disappeared between the trees. She didn't know why she felt uneasy. Everett's journey to the port began with hope. He imagined the coins he'd receive, the relief on his children's faces, the way Olivia would smile when he returned with a rose wrapped in linen. But reality was colder than dream. When he arrived, the ship had already been claimed. Word had spread of its arrival, and Everett's many debts had swallowed it whole. Everything, cargo, crates, coin, was gone. He begged for extensions, pleaded with old contacts, but it was no use. The books were closed. The accounts were empty. That night, weary and ashamed, Everett left the city without stopping to rest. He rode into the hills, thinking only of the long road home and the disappointed faces waiting there. But fate had one more turn to offer. The sky darkened too quickly. Rain lashed the trees. Thunder roared. His horse, spooked by a nearby crack of lightning, bolted from the trail and into unfamiliar woods. Branches clawed at them. Mud swallowed their path. Just when Everett began to despair, a stone wall appeared through the haze. Behind it, a towering gate creaked slightly open. With no better option, he entered. What lay beyond the gate was not a ruin or barn, but a mansion, enormous, austere. It looked abandoned, yet strangely alive. Vines curled along its stone walls, windows glowed faintly, and the silence held its breath. He knocked. No answer. Desperate, soaked and shivering, Everett pushed open the door. Inside was a grand hall. Shadows danced along the walls, and suits of armor stood like watchers in the dark. At the far end, warm light spilled from a doorway. There, a fire blazed. A table stood set for one. No host appeared, and so Everett waited. Then quietly, he ate. Bread, roasted meat, a cup of wine. He told himself it was a kindness left by a generous stranger. He would explain in the morning. With sleep heavy on his eyes and sorrow in his chest, he dozed by the fire. And somewhere in the deep hush of the house, something watched. Morning rain trickled down the tall windows. Inside the grand, silent hall, Everett stirred slowly from sleep. He lay still for a moment, his mind fogged with images from a dream. Warm firelight, the smell of bread lingering on a table, the wind howling beyond a heavy door. It took time before he fully recalled where he was. He had entered a place not his own, eaten a stranger's meal, slept in a house without invitation. A flush of shame rose in his chest, tangled with gratitude for having survived the storm. Not wishing to cause further offense, Everett decided to leave quietly before anyone returned. He moved carefully through the great hall, stepping around armored statues that seemed to watch him with unseen eyes. Pushing open the main door, he stepped into the misty courtyard, the air crisp with morning. His horse still waited, safe under the stone archway. He stroked her mane gently, whispering thanks. As he reached into his saddlebag for the last apple Olivia had packed, his fingers brushed a small linen handkerchief wrapped around bread. And that was when he remembered. The rose. That fragile, offhand request had almost been lost in the turmoil of the night. Yet now, it returned with full weight. He had no treasure, no finery, but he could keep his word to the only child who'd asked for nothing of worth. Passing by a crumbling pergola wrapped in ivy and moss, he paused. Beneath it bloomed a stunning rose garden, lush, proud, serene. Blush pink petals shimmered with dew, delicate and wild. Everett felt his breath catch. Never had he seen such tender beauty thrive so boldly. Drawing his small blade from his satchel, he knelt and clipped a single perfect bloom, then another and another. "One rose will not be enough for what she's given me," he murmured. Carefully, reverently, he kept gathering. He was so absorbed that he didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. A voice echoed, low, rough as thunder muffled by trees. "What do you think you are doing?" Everett turned sharply. Before him stood a towering man. Or was it a man? His frame was immense, his hair wild and tangled like a lion's mane, his face shadowed by coarse features. Yet it was the eyes that rooted Everett in place. Eyes not furious, but ancient, like a well that had seen too many winters. I didn't realize anyone lived here," Everett stammered. "I thought just one rose for my daughter. She's never seen one." The figure's tone did not rise, but it deepened. "Not one rose," he said. "You've stripped the entire bush. It was my mother's. There are no others like it. Every bloom is priceless." Everett bowed his head, trembling. "I have nothing to give you, no silver, no gold. I've lost everything." Silence fell heavy. Then, with quiet intensity, the figure spoke. "Then you will repay with labor. You'll remain here, serve this house, work off your debt." Everett's eyes widened. "I have children, 6 of them. They need me. I can't stay." The being's face remained unmoved. "Then one of them must take your place." It was not a suggestion. It was a sentence. "You have 1 week," the figure said, then turned and vanished into the great doors, leaving Everett frozen among scattered petals. The journey home was long and silent. Everett said nothing at first. Olivia was the first to notice the change in him. She took the roses with quiet joy, pressing her face into the velvet soft petals, her eyes lighting up. But she looked at her father's pale face and knew something was wrong. That night, under the flickering glow of an oil lamp in their tiny kitchen, Everett told the story about the mansion, the storm, the fire, the food, the roses, and the debt that now hung over their heads. His older children shouted. Some cursed, others slunk away into shadowed corners. Only Olivia stayed. She did not cry. She did not panic. After a long silence, she simply said, "I'll go." Everett jolted. "No, you are the one child I cannot bear to lose." Olivia placed her hand gently over his. "That's exactly why you must stay. They need you, Papa. But I can adapt." And so, a week later, as morning fog drifted through the trees and wind whispered through the eaves, Olivia stepped onto the road with her father. In her pocket, she carried the rose he had brought home. In her heart, there was no fear, only one clear thing: a promise. Father and daughter reached the stone gate at dusk, just as the last light of day slipped behind the forest canopy. The castle rose like a forgotten memory from a storybook, its moss-covered walls, narrow, towering windows, and arched rooftops giving it the look of something once majestic and now asleep beneath a spell of time. Everett brought the cart to a slow stop, his fingers tightening slightly on the reins. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice trembling, not from cold, but from worry. Olivia gave him a small smile, her eyes soft like the fading autumn sun. "I'm ready, Papa." They approached the great oak door, blackened with age and bound in iron. Everett knocked 3 times with the heavy brass ring. The sound echoed like thunder down unseen hallways. They waited. Wind whispered through the eaves, lifting the curtain behind a high window like a breath. Then, quietly, the door creaked open. There was no beast, no ancient butler. Instead, standing before them was a boy, perhaps 12 or 13, his brown sweater worn at the cuffs, his hair tousled, his eyes bright with mischief, but not fear, as if he'd been expecting them. "You the new help?" he asked plainly. Everett hesitated a moment, then nudged Olivia gently forward. "My daughter, Olivia. She's come to fulfill the agreement. In my place." The boy glanced at Olivia briefly, then nodded. "Come in." He opened the door wider and called over his shoulder, "Leave the trunk in the hall. Your father can go now." Everett gave his daughter's shoulder one final squeeze. "Be safe," he whispered. Olivia nodded, lips pressed together. They parted without another word, afraid, perhaps, that more would make it harder. The boy's name was Theo. Olivia would learn that as he led her up a wide, spiraling staircase to the east wing of the castle. "I do what I can around here," he said casually as they walked, lugging her small trunk with surprising ease. "The place is huge, but only a few rooms really matter anymore." They passed portraits lining the hallway, faded faces of noble ancestors, watching silently from their gilded frames. In the flickering light, Olivia could have sworn their painted eyes followed her. "This is your room," Theo said, stopping in front of a dark wood door. When Olivia stepped inside, it felt like entering a dream stitched from memory and longing. It wasn't grand, but it was warm. A canopied bed stood against the wall, a writing desk waited by the window, and the fireplace was already crackling thanks to Theo's handiwork. "The master says he'll meet you tomorrow," the boy added. "I'll bring supper up tonight." Then, as quickly as he had appeared, Theo vanished. Olivia exhaled slowly, surveying the space as if she needed to memorize it. From her satchel, she pulled a small notebook. Inside was a rose, dried and flattened, its once bright petals now softly faded. The rose her father had brought her. She smiled at it gently. "For this promise," she whispered, "a new life begins." That first evening passed in near silence. A tray arrived outside her door, soup, bread, tea, and no sign of who had delivered it. But Olivia felt watched in a kind, quiet way, as though the walls themselves remembered how to care. That night, by the glow of the fire, Olivia dreamt of wandering the dark corridors of the castle. A large dog walked ahead of her, guiding her through doorways and staircases like a ghost with a purpose. It vanished into a room lit by golden light. When she looked inside, she saw the back of a man sitting at a desk. He began to turn toward her. She woke before she saw his face. In the morning, sunlight filtered through the thick curtains. A knock at the door. Theo again, with a breakfast tray in hand. "The master wants to see you after you eat," he said, setting the tray down. When Olivia arrived at the grand chamber where her father had once unknowingly dined, her heart beat faster. The door opened. Seated by the hearth was a towering man, thickly bearded, with a face that might have frightened her if not for the deep tiredness behind his eyes. "You're the one who's come in your father's place?" he asked. Olivia nodded politely. "Good. Let's begin." The man who sat across from Olivia introduced himself only as Graham. He didn't bow or extend a hand, but simply gestured for her to sit by the fire. His voice was deep, rough like gravel, but his words were clear, careful. "This place, it's much too large for one person," he said. "You'll help keep it in order. Theo does what he can, and his mother brings food from town. But beyond that, it's just me." Olivia nodded, listening. She didn't ask questions. She sensed Graham wasn't a man used to being asked anything. He handed her a ring of iron keys. They open most rooms. Use what you need. Decide what matters. Just leave the West Tower locked. There was no threat in his voice, just weariness. A man who had long since stopped explaining himself. The castle revealed itself slowly. That day, Olivia and Theo began in the kitchen. It had clearly once been elegant. Marble countertops, copper pans hanging in tidy rows, and iron ovens built with loving craftsmanship. But now it wore layers of dust and silence. Together they scrubbed. Theo fetched supplies. Olivia opened the windows, letting in the sweet sting of autumn air. The place came alive, little by little. She roasted a simple chicken, using herbs from the overgrown garden. It wasn't fancy, but the warmth of real food filled the great dining hall with comfort. When she arrived at dinner that evening, Graham was already seated. He looked at the food, then at her, and gave a small nod. "It's been a long time since this house smelled like home," he murmured. They ate mostly in silence, but when she addressed him as Sir, he shook his head. "Just Graham," he said. "There are no titles left here, only names." He paused, then added softly, "You've done well." "Thank you." It was the first kindness in his voice she'd heard. The next morning, Olivia found herself drawn to a particular door in the east wing. The key clicked smoothly, and as it swung open, she gasped. It was a library. No, more than that, a cathedral of books. Golden light spilled from tall windows onto rows of shelves, rising all the way to the domed ceiling. Rolling ladders rested against the walls. Tables stood in quiet readiness, piled with open volumes and leather-bound journals. She stepped reverently inside. The air was warm and smelled of ink and memory. She whispered, "It's like a dream." Before she could take more than a few steps, Graham appeared in the doorway. "Please," he said, "don't disturb the stacks. Some are part of ongoing research." She immediately apologized and backed away, but he waved it off gently. "I'm not angry, just careful. Books are how I spend most of my time." She hesitated, then asked, "Is there one you'd recommend?" A small smile pulled at the edge of his lips. "You're a reader?" She nodded. He moved to the lower shelf and retrieved a slim volume. Socrates. He believed questions were more powerful than answers. A good place to begin. She accepted the book like a gift. Before she left the room, she turned back to him. "Would you mind if I brought in someone to tend the garden? Just before winter?" He stiffened. "If you can find anyone willing, then yes. But most won't come near this place. Too many old stories. Too much fear." She didn't press further, but she made a silent promise to try. That week, Olivia began writing regular letters to her father. She told him not to worry, that the man she worked for was strange, yes, but not cruel. That she had her own room, that the castle was mysterious but not unkind. She did not tell him that she sometimes dreamed of walking its halls with no shoes, guided by a dog who vanished when she tried to follow. She did not say that the fire in the library never seemed to go out, or that the mirrors in certain rooms showed things that weren't quite there. Instead, she wrote of her progress, how the kitchen gleamed now, how the bedroom she cleaned still smelled faintly of perfume and a time long gone. She described the library in detail, though no words seemed to do it justice. She also wrote of Graham, how he spoke little, but quoted philosophers like old friends, how he never once raised his voice, how sometimes, when she glanced at him just right, She could almost see another face behind the one he wore. Less wild, more gentle. Not quite a stranger, but someone she might have known in another life. And how, in those moments, her heart softened. One afternoon, as she passed the old rose garden, Olivia saw Graham standing by the pergola. The rose bush, the one her father had stripped bare months ago, was beginning to bloom again. "I thought it was lost," she whispered. He shook his head. "It was my mother's. She said love planted with sorrow blooms twice." Then, without looking at her, he added, "I've been alone a long time, but you've made this place feel alive again." Olivia didn't answer, but she reached out and gently brushed one of the new rosebuds with her fingertips. And that evening, when she returned to the library, she sat beside the fire, opened her book, and began to read aloud. To the silence, to herself, and maybe somewhere nearby, to someone listening. Spring softened the edges of the old stone walls, dressing the courtyard in the perfume of new blooms. The roses, once stripped bare, had returned, delicate, proud, and pink as a promise. Olivia tended them each morning. She didn't know why exactly, only that something in her heart felt steadier when her hands were in the soil. Graham watched from the upstairs window, unseen. He never interrupted. He never thanked her. But the corner of his mouth curled faintly every time he saw her kneel by the pergola. He had begun leaving books outside her door, volumes on philosophy, history, botany, even poetry. At first she was intimidated, but she read them anyway, scribbling notes into the margins and underlining passages that made her pause. One night, over a quiet dinner, she found the courage to ask, "Why do you read so much?" Graham didn't look up from his plate. "To remember what I forgot," he said simply. Then, after a long silence, he added, "and to become someone else." In the weeks that followed, Olivia grew used to the rhythm of the chateau. In the mornings, she worked. She polished brass, aired out ancient bedrooms, and organized linen closets no one used. In the afternoons, she read. Sometimes in the courtyard, sometimes in the grand library, sometimes curled in the window seat of her room, a blanket around her shoulders and the light spilling across her pages. But it was the evenings she liked best. Dinner with Graham had become more than obligation. It was comfort. They rarely talked much, yet there was a kind of understanding in the silence between them, like the stillness between notes in a song. Some nights, he quoted something he'd read. Other nights, he asked her thoughts on a passage she'd marked. And sometimes, only sometimes, he told her stories about the house, about the people who had lived there, about his mother, who used to hum to the roses as she trimmed them. He never spoke of what had happened to her, but his eyes did. One rainy afternoon, as thunder growled over the forest, Olivia found herself wandering a hallway she'd never entered before. Her key turned in a stubborn lock. The door creaked open. The room inside was unlike the others, bright, well-kept, and unmistakably feminine. A dressing table stood by the window, its surface scattered with jars of powder, brushes, and ornate perfume bottles that still glinted in the dim light. A stand beside the wardrobe held 3 elegant wigs styled for a long-forgotten ball. And the closet? She opened it carefully. Inside hung gowns of the old world, rich silks and jewel tones, each one more breathtaking than the last. She touched the sleeve of a sapphire blue dress and imagined what it might have felt like to twirl in it under candlelight. There was a chest of drawers. She opened it gently and found velvet-lined boxes of jewelry. One ring caught her eye, a delicate gold band with a single sapphire, dark and luminous. She held it in her hand a moment too long, then quickly returned it and shut the drawer. As she turned to leave, she caught her own reflection in the dressing mirror. But something was off. For just a moment, she didn't see her own face, but a different one. Older, perhaps, sadder, dressed in that blue gown, with the ring on her hand. She blinked. The image was gone. That night, Olivia couldn't sleep. The wind outside howled like wolves, and the old glass rattled in its frames. She sat in her bed, blanket clutched around her, staring at the fire in the grate. Its light flickered across the room, making the walls seem to breathe. She thought about the woman from the mirror, about Graham, about the ring, and about how the chateau seemed to remember things its owner never spoke of. At breakfast the next morning, she found Graham unusually quiet. Even for him, she decided to risk a question. "Why did you stay here all these years?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. "Because I was cursed." She laughed softly, unsure if it was a joke, but his expression didn't change. "I was vain," he said. "Spoiled, arrogant. I believed the world owed me beauty and praise. And when a woman came to the door one night, cold, hungry, asking for help, I turned her away." He didn't look at her. "She told me that my ugliness was not on the outside yet, but it would be. And until someone saw past it, I would remain this way." Olivia sat frozen, her spoon hovering over her tea. "You think you're enchanted?" she whispered. "I know I am." The wind sighed outside, brushing against the windows like an old regret. Later, Olivia stood in the hallway, staring at the mirror again. Was the face she saw real, or just memory? She didn't know, but she felt something in her chest, like the weight of someone else's sorrow, now resting in her hands. That evening, she brought 2 candles to the library and lit them beside her chair. She opened a worn book of poetry and began to read aloud. She didn't know if Graham could hear her from his study, but the shadows on the walls seemed to lean in. And when she looked up at the window, she saw her own reflection there. Only this time, it was fully her own. And she smiled. It was nearly summer when the letter came. Folded neatly and sealed in wax, it arrived with Gabriel on one of his usual trips to the village. Olivia found it resting on her breakfast plate next to a warm slice of buttered bread and a dish of strawberries. It was from her father. Her eldest sister, Annalise, was getting married in 2 weeks. The ceremony would be simple, just a church service and a garden luncheon. But Olivia's presence was requested, expected even. A family gathering, a symbol of their restored respectability. Graham glanced at her over his tea as she read. "You should go," he said gently. "Your family misses you." Olivia looked up. "Will you be all right?" Graham offered a half smile. "I've lived through worse than a weekend without tea." She didn't laugh. Something in his eyes gave her pause. Something quiet, something hollow. "Will you come with me?" she asked suddenly. The air between them shifted. "To the wedding?" he asked, surprised. She nodded. "You've stayed hidden here too long." Graham set down his cup. "Olivia, I don't think..." She cut him off. "You've done the work. You've made amends. You've spent years in solitude, in study, in sorrow. Maybe it's time the world saw who you've become." He looked away. "People are cruel," he murmured. "They stare, they whisper. I am difficult to look at." "Not to me," she said. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, the room was still. It took a week to prepare. Gabriel helped her pack, chatting cheerfully as he folded dresses and tucked books into a satchel. Meanwhile, Olivia worked with the village tailor to have a new suit made for Graham, a simple one in modern style, free of ruffles or lace or decades-old embroidery, the kind of clothes a man might wear when he wanted to be noticed for his dignity, not his scars. When Graham first saw the suit, he frowned. "You expect me to walk into a village looking like this?" "Yes," she said, "like a man with nothing to hide." He shook his head, but said no more. The morning they left, Gabriel stood at the chateau gate and watched them drive off. The carriage rattled gently along the forest road, sunlight pouring through the leaves above. Summer was beginning to blush on every branch. Inside the carriage, Olivia reached for Graham's hand. He didn't pull away. The village was warm with celebration. Bells rang from the chapel steeple. Flowers bloomed in windowsills. Long tables were set in the meadow beyond the church, draped in white linen and stacked with sweet cakes, sugared fruit, and pitchers of lemonade. Olivia's family greeted her with loud hugs and bright chatter. But the moment they saw Graham, the mood shifted. Her siblings stared. One of them, her younger brother, snorted quietly behind his hand. Whispers rippled through the gathering like a chill wind before a storm. Graham stood quietly, eyes low. Only her father, Edward, approached him with grace. He extended a hand, thanked Graham for accompanying his daughter, and welcomed him to their home. His handshake was firm, his eyes kind. But the others? They stared as if he were not a guest, but a ghost. At the wedding, Olivia sat with Graham at the edge of the gathering. They were surrounded by smiles, but none turned toward them. It was only during the reception that the cruelty became unbearable. She overheard two men near the lemonade table. "He's got gold, I'll give him that," one muttered. "But no woman in her right mind would marry a man with a face like that." The other laughed. "Maybe that's why he dragged his maid along." Olivia turned. Her hands trembled. Her breath caught. But her voice, when it came, was steady. She stepped into the center of the celebration, lifted her chin, and spoke. Everyone listened. Chatter faded. Forks paused midair. The music stilled. "I asked this man to come here," Olivia said, "because he's kind, because he's generous, because he is more human than any of you who sit here gossiping and judging." A silence fell over the meadow. "I have come to know him in the quiet, in the long months of labor and learning. He is gentle, he is wise, he is brave, and I would choose him as a companion 100 times over any of you." Gasps stirred. And then it happened. Right before their eyes, his form began to shift. The beard receded. The heaviness in his features melted away. The scars faded like morning mist. Standing before them was not the beast they had feared, but a man. A beautiful, dignified man with steady eyes and a grateful smile. Only Olivia seemed unsurprised. She had already seen him this way, many times before. No one spoke of it afterward. It was as if the spell had lifted not only from Graham, but from their memories as well. The villagers greeted him kindly. Her siblings offered warm congratulations. Laughter resumed, music played, and the party went on as if nothing had changed. But Olivia knew something miraculous had occurred, and it had nothing to do with magic. It had everything to do with love. They returned to the chateau as summer burst into full bloom. The road back felt lighter than when they'd left. Even the forest trees seemed to sway in welcome. Sunlight spilled across the carriage path like gold dust, and the air smelled of wild flowers and warmed stone. Olivia leaned back in her seat, her hand resting lightly atop Graham's. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was no need. Silence between them now was a form of closeness. Gabriel was waiting at the gate. When he saw them, he gasped aloud, first in surprise, then in joy. He rushed to open the carriage door and stopped in his tracks, staring up at Graham with wide, astonished eyes. "You look different," he whispered. Graham smiled, an easy, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. "So I'm told." Gabriel turned to Olivia. Was it magic?" "No," she said softly. "It was the truth." The boy beamed. "Welcome home." Back inside, the chateau felt changed. Not in its structure. The grand staircases still curved like stone ribbons. The portraits still stared solemnly down the corridors. But in spirit, the cold corners were warmer. The air felt less still. The rooms seemed to breathe with quiet hope, as though they'd waited years for someone to open a window. Olivia's first stop was the rose bush, the very one her father had once stripped bare. Now, under the pergola's dappled shade, it was overflowing with blooms, soft pinks and rich crimsons, nodding in the breeze like old friends. She crouched beside it and ran her fingers gently over the petals. "This," she whispered, "is what healing looks like." Behind her, footsteps approached. Graham's. He stood watching her for a long time before speaking. "I was wrong, you know," he said. Olivia turned, shading her eyes. "About what?" "I thought I had to earn my way out of that curse. I thought if I studied enough, repented enough, withdrew far enough, maybe I'd be worthy." He paused. "But you didn't love me because I was perfect. You loved me because I was honest." She rose, brushing earth from her skirt. "And brave," she added, "and kind." He reached into his coat pocket. "Something small, something velvet." "I've held onto this for many years," Graham said quietly. "I didn't think I'd ever use it, but then you came." He opened the box. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was the sapphire ring, the very one Olivia had once glimpsed in the mysterious bedroom, the one that had glinted like a secret in the drawer. Now it sparkled openly in the sunlight. Graham knelt. "I've lived in the shadows. You brought me into the light. Will you stay by my side, Olivia, through seasons, through silence, through whatever comes next?" Her breath caught. Her heart did not. She nodded. "I already have." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had always belonged there. They didn't announce the engagement with fanfare or fuss. No town criers, no gilded invitations. Just a quiet joy that wove itself through the house, through Gabriel's humming as he worked, through the scent of lavender that Olivia tucked into the linen drawers, through the sound of Graham's footsteps echoing through the once lonely halls, no longer heavy with grief. They planned a simple ceremony, not in the chapel of her village, nor in the drawing room of the estate, but beneath the rose-covered pergola. It had started the story. It would bless its next chapter. The guest list was small. Her father, Edward, arrived early and wept openly when he saw his daughter in a pale blue gown. He hugged Graham with sincerity. I misjudged you," he admitted. "Thank you for proving me wrong." Even Annalise and the other siblings came, their eyes softer than before. No laughter at his appearance, no sideways glances, just a quiet acknowledgement that something remarkable had taken place. The ceremony was brief. Under the late summer sky, Olivia and Graham spoke vows they had written themselves. There were no grand declarations, just promises spoken gently, with trembling hands and shining eyes. Promises to protect each other's peace, to honor each other's silence, to grow together through every season. As they kissed, a warm breeze stirred the roses, and somewhere in the garden, a bird began to sing. That night, the chateau glowed, not with chandeliers or candles, but with something older, something softer, a kind of sacred stillness, as if the very stones of the house sighed with contentment. Graham stood at the library window, gazing out at the courtyard. Olivia joined him, resting her head against his shoulder. "I used to believe I was broken," he said, "but maybe I was just unfinished." She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. "You weren't broken," she whispered. "You were becoming." He turned to her, his face illuminated by moonlight. "So were you." They stood like that for a long time, two souls who had wandered through ruin and silence, now found, now full, now home. In the garden below, the roses swayed. And in the heart of the chateau, love had taken root. Summer deepened into golden days. In the chateau, laughter no longer echoed. It lived. The once dusty rooms had been aired and awakened, filled now with music, soft voices, and the clink of teacups at twilight. Olivia often found herself barefoot in the kitchen garden, gathering herbs, or seated beneath the pergola with a book, the sapphire ring on her finger, catching sun with every turn of the page. Yet even in this piece, something tugged quietly at the edges of her mind. It began with a door, not one she used regularly, not one that stood out, but one she passed every day while moving from the library to the kitchen corridor. A small, rounded door, different from the others, older, with an iron keyhole so rusted it looked almost forgotten by time itself. She asked Graham about it one evening. He frowned thoughtfully. "There are rooms even I haven't seen," he admitted. "This house has more secrets than I ever tried to chase." That night, the keys in Olivia's desk drawer called to her. She spread them out on a cloth and examined each one beneath the glow of the bedside lamp. Some she recognized. Some were still a mystery. But one, a narrow silver key with a twisted neck, seemed to hum with importance. At dawn, she slipped it into the strange door's lock. It turned. The door groaned open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into the earth. Torch in hand, she descended slowly, heart beating steadily in her ears. The air grew cooler. Stone walls closed in around her. At the bottom, she found another door, wooden, reinforced with iron. She pushed gently. It opened. The room beyond was not a cellar, nor a vault. It was a sanctuary. The walls were lined with carvings, ancient symbols etched into the stone by hand. A circle had been traced into the center of the floor, surrounded by flickering candle stubs and dried rose petals. The air smelled of myrrh and forgotten prayers. In the middle of the room was a single item, a large mirror, but it did not reflect Olivia's face. It reflected memory. She stepped closer, peering in. The mirror shimmered, and then showed her a vision. Graham, years ago, younger, arrogant, laughing amidst a roaring crowd in the great hall. He raised a goblet, oblivious to the weariness in the eyes of his servants. Another vision, him rejecting an old woman at the door, waving her away with irritation. Then the mirror shifted again. Olivia saw herself as a child kneeling in a village garden, as a girl learning to bake from a kindly neighbor, as a young woman choosing kindness over comfort, tending to her father, sacrificing finery for simplicity. And then both their images merged, two paths weaving into one. The mirror shimmered again, then went dark. Behind her, a presence stirred. Olivia turned slowly. It was Graham. "I followed your light," he said simply. She blinked. "You knew of this room?" "I'd only heard rumors," he said, stepping forward. "My mother spoke of it once, before she passed. She said it was the heart of the house, that it shows truth, but only to those who seek it with love." Olivia looked back at the mirror. I think this was the place where the curse began." Graham nodded. "And the place it ended." She reached for his hand. Their fingers met, interlocked like threads in a tapestry. "I want to leave this room open," Olivia said. "Not as a warning, but as a remembrance of who we were and how we changed." He smiled at her, eyes shining. "Then it shall remain unlocked." They ascended the steps together, and as they passed through the once sealed door, a warm breeze followed them up, like a sigh of release from the walls themselves. Weeks passed, then months. The countryside turned to gold, then rust, then white. The village, once skeptical, grew curious about the lord and lady of the great house on the hill. Letters began arriving, some timid, some hopeful. A girl asked for lessons in reading. A farmer offered fresh eggs in thanks for past charity. Slowly, cautiously, the boundary between the world and the chateau began to blur. One morning in early spring, Olivia stood by the front gates. A child approached, a girl with tangled hair and a face smudged with flour. She held out a drawing, done in charcoal, of the chateau and a small rose beside it. "For you," the girl said shyly. Olivia bent down and smiled. "It's beautiful." "She says you're a fairy," the girl whispered. "Who says?" "My grandma," the child replied, pointing to a woman down the road. "She says you made the beast kind." Olivia laughed softly. "He was always kind. He just forgot how to show it." The girl's eyes widened. "Are you a queen, then?" Olivia looked back at the estate, at the open windows, the warm hearths, the life blooming in every corner. Then, at the ring on her finger. "No," she said gently, "but I get to love someone who became a king." That night, Graham and Olivia walked through the gardens hand in hand. The rose bush rustled in the breeze, its petals glowing beneath the moon. "You once told me," he said, "that healing looks like a blooming rose." She nodded. "And what does love look like?" She turned to him. "Like you," she whispered, "still growing, still choosing light." They kissed beneath the pergola, and in that kiss, years of solitude faded. Wounds healed, a house breathed, and a story, once told in silence, now sang with every heartbeat of its walls. The end of the curse was not the end of the tale. It was the beginning of something far more sacred. Home. The end. And so, under the shade of blooming roses and in the glow of a golden dusk, they found what neither of them had searched for, but both had longed for all their lives. Not riches, not beauty, not even freedom, but the quiet miracle of being truly seen and deeply loved. What if the beast inside us was only waiting for someone brave enough to stay long enough to listen? And what if the love we think is hidden in fairy tales was just waiting in the still corners of the heart to be awakened? Thank you for dreaming with us tonight. If this story touched your soul, leave a quiet light behind, a like, a share, or a simple comment. And until we meet again, sleep gently, love bravely, and never forget, even in the darkest castle, a rose still remembers how to bloom. Flower